They buried her alive in a world that forgot her name. For 5 years, Duke Adrian Blackmore mourned at an empty grave, grieving the brilliant girl he'd chosen over every nobleman's daughter in the kingdom. For 5 years, Alara Witcom scrubbed his floors, starved in his basement, beaten until she couldn't remember her own face. The dead don't come back. Until they do. When a scar on a servant's wrist shatters everything he thought he knew, grief becomes rage, and a duke's vengeance knows no mercy. Stay until the end to see how the erased girl becomes the one no one can ignore. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see where you're watching from. The Witcom estate stood like a monument to ambition. 3 stories of pale stone and ivy-covered walls, windows that caught the morning sun and turned it into blinding gold. Inside, however, the light never quite reached the corners where Alara lived. At 16, she'd learned to make herself small. Not because she was meek. Anyone who'd survived Ophelia Witcom as a stepmother knew meekness was just another word for target practice. No, Alara made herself small because brilliance in a girl without the right bloodline was dangerous. Beautiful stepsisters could be bartered. Plain ones could be married off to merchants. But a sharp-tongued girl who read philosophy, corrected tutors, and refused to giggle at elderly lords. She was a liability. "You're doing it again." Alara looked up from her book, a borrowed copy of Principles of Natural Law, hidden behind a needlework hoop, to find her stepsister Vivian leaning in the doorway. 17, golden-haired, with the kind of face that made men write terrible poetry. "Doing what?" Alara asked. "Thinking." Vivian wrinkled her nose as if the concept smelled bad. "Mother says it makes your face hard. Men don't like hard faces." "Then it's fortunate I don't particularly care what men like." "You will when you're 25 and unmarried." Alara returned to her book. "I'll manage." Vivian drifted closer, silk skirts whispering across the floor. "Is that why you rejected Lord Pemberton? And Sir Marcus? And that nice young earl from—" "They weren't nice. They were boring." Alara turned a page. "Lord Pemberton spent 40 minutes explaining how his kennels were organized. Sir Marcus believes women shouldn't read because it overheats the blood. And that earl was 63 with 6 children older than me. Mother says you're too particular." "Mother says a lot of things." What Ophelia said, specifically, was that Alara was an ungrateful wretch who should be thankful for the roof over her head, the food on her plate, and the fact that she hadn't been thrown into the streets when her father remarried. What she meant was that Alara's very existence was an insult to the daughters who deserved better, the daughters she'd actually birthed. "She's planning something," Vivian said quietly. "I heard her talking to father last night." Alara's fingers stilled on the page. "About?" "You. And Adrian Blackmore." The name landed like a stone in still water. Adrian Blackmore, second son of the Duke of Ashbourne, 22 years old, newly returned from military service with a reputation for being intelligent, reserved, and utterly uninterested in the marriage market's pageantry. He'd refused every introduction, declined every dinner invitation, and generally made it clear that he'd rather face a cavalry charge than another ballroom. Until last month, when he'd attended the midsummer ball at Lord Chancellor Rothmore's estate and spent the entire evening talking to Alara about military strategy, legal reform, and whether constitutional monarchy was sustainable in an age of industrial expansion. They'd talked for 4 hours. She'd forgotten to be careful. "What did Mother say?" Alara asked. Vivian glanced over her shoulder, then closed the door. "That he's been asking about you, sent 3 letters, told father he intends to call this week." Alara's heart did something complicated. "That's good?" "Not if your mother—" Vivian sat on the edge of the settee, lowering her voice. "She said Blackmore's interest in you is a tactical error that needs correcting, that his family won't allow him to marry a girl with no fortune and a dead mother, that father needs to manage expectations before you embarrass yourself." "Embarrass myself," Alara repeated flatly. "Or embarrass her by succeeding where her daughters haven't?" Vivian flinched. "That's not—" "It is. You know it is." For a moment, something like shame crossed Vivian's face. Then it was gone, replaced by the careful blankness she wore around their mother. "Just be careful," she said. "Please." Adrian Blackmore arrived on a Thursday. Alara watched from the second-floor window as his carriage pulled up, black lacquer and silver fittings, drawn by 4 matched grays that probably cost more than the Witcom estate's annual income. He stepped out like a man who'd never questioned his right to exist, tall, dark-haired, with the kind of contained energy that suggested he was always thinking 3 moves ahead. He'd brought flowers, white roses, her favorites. "Alara!" Ophelia's voice cracked like a whip from downstairs. "Come here, now!" She found her stepmother in the drawing room, dressed in burgundy silk that made her look like an angry cardinal. Vivian and her younger sister Celestine stood behind her like pale shadows. "Sit," Ophelia commanded. Alara sat. "Mr. Blackmore has requested an audience with you. Against my advice, your father has permitted it. You will receive him politely, thank him for his attention, and make it clear that his suit is inappropriate." "Inappropriate," Alara repeated. "Why?" "Because you're 16 with no dowry, no connections, and no prospects beyond what this family provides. Because the Blackmores are one of the oldest ducal families in the kingdom, and they don't marry girls who read philosophy books at dinner parties like some eccentric bluestocking." Celestine giggled. Vivian looked at the floor. "He seems to like that I read," Alara said carefully. "He's young and foolish. His father isn't. The Duke of Ashbourne will never allow this match, and when Adrian realizes that, you'll be left with nothing but a reputation as the girl who aimed too high. Do you understand?" What Alara understood was that Ophelia was terrified. Because if Adrian Blackmore, second son or not, chose her, it meant everything Ophelia had built her daughter's value on was worthless. Beauty, docility, simpering charm, none of it mattered if intelligence and genuine conversation could win a better prize. "May I speak with him?" Alara asked. Briefly and appropriately. Adrian stood when she entered the parlor, and something in his expression made her chest tight. He looked at her like she was the only solid thing in a shifting world. "Miss Witcom," he said, "you look well. You brought roses. You mentioned they were your favorites. During your highly detailed explanation of why the Rothmore estate's gardens are structurally inefficient." Despite everything, she smiled. "They are inefficient. A formal parterre requires constant maintenance for minimal aesthetic return. A naturalistic design would be more sustainable and actually attract pollinators. See, that." He crossed the room in 3 strides, stopped just close enough to be improper. "That's why I couldn't stop thinking about you. Everyone else talks about gardens like they're decoration. You talk about them like they're systems, like everything matters and connects and has purpose. Most people find that tedious. Most people are idiots." She laughed, actually laughed, and his whole face transformed. "I want to call on you properly," he said. "With your father's permission, court you, bore you with my thoughts on agricultural reform and whether the new railway system will fundamentally alter class mobility. Would you?" "Yes," Alara said. "Yes, I would like that very much." For one perfect moment, the world was simple. Then Ophelia's voice cut through from the doorway. "How lovely, though I'm afraid Alara has other commitments this season. Family obligations, you understand." Adrian's jaw tightened. "I'll speak with Mr. Witcom about arranging. My husband and I will discuss it and send word." She smiled like a snake in silk. Adrian looked at Alara, questions in his eyes. She managed a tiny nod. "It's fine, I'll handle it," and watched him leave with a sick feeling in her stomach. The door had barely closed when Ophelia turned. "You stupid, greedy girl." It happened fast. 3 days later, Alara woke to shouting downstairs. She'd barely thrown on a dressing gown when Vivian burst into her room, face white. "You need to run," she hissed. "Now! Mother convinced father you're a liability. They're sending you away." "Away where?" "I don't know. But I heard her say problem solved, and I saw servants packing your things, and Alara, please, you have to—" The door slammed open. 2 men she'd never seen before filled the frame. Broad-shouldered, expressionless, the kind of men who did things for money and didn't ask questions. "Miss Witcom," one said flatly, "come with us." "No." Alara backed toward the window. "No, I want to speak to my father." "Your father has made his decision." They moved fast. One grabbed her arms, the other pressed something cloth and chemical over her face, and the world went fuzzy at the edges, sound fading to cotton and distance. The last thing she heard was Vivian screaming, then nothing. She woke in a moving carriage, hands bound, head pounding. Across from her sat Ophelia, looking at her like a woman examining a stain she'd successfully removed. "Where are we going?" Alara's voice cracked. "Somewhere appropriate for a girl of your actual station." "What does that mean?" "It means," Ophelia said calmly, "that you were always temporary, a charity case. Your mother's daughter tolerated out of obligation to a dead woman's memory, but charity has limits, and you've exceeded yours." Terror clawed up Alara's throat. "Adrian will look for me. Adrian Blackmore will mourn the tragic death of Miss Alara Witcom, who succumbed to fever last night despite the best efforts of 3 physicians. Your grave is already dug. The funeral is tomorrow. Your father will weep convincingly." The words didn't make sense, couldn't make sense. "You can't. People know me, they'll remember a sickly girl who kept to herself, who had no mother, no connections, no one who'd question her loss beyond polite condolences." Ophelia leaned forward. "You never mattered, Alara. You just forgot that for a moment." The carriage stopped. Outside, Alara could see the docks, massive ships, cargo nets, the smell of salt and tar, and unwashed humanity. Men in work clothes hauling crates, women in rags selling fish from buckets. "No," Alara whispered. "No, please." "You'll work off your passage to the northern labor colonies. 7 years if you survive. After that, you're free to make whatever life a girl with no name can manage." Ophelia's smile was gentle, almost maternal. "Consider it a lesson in gratitude." They dragged her out of the carriage. She fought, kicked, screamed, clawed, but they were stronger, and the docks were full of people who'd learned not to see things that weren't their business. Someone hit her hard enough that stars exploded across her vision. Then she was in a wagon with 15 other girls, all bound, all terrified. The wagon lurched forward. Behind them a man called out, "Alara Witcom." She twisted, saw the dockmaster checking a manifest. "Alara Witcom, deceased," a clerk corrected. "This lot's under work names. That one's Mary Stone." "Mary Stone," the dockmaster repeated, making a mark. "Bound for Thornfield Estate, Northern Provinces. Hard labor, 7-year contract." Just like that, Alara Witcom died. Mary Stone was born in chains. Thornfield Estate was 2 weeks' journey north, through countryside that went from green to gray to frozen, past villages that got smaller and meaner until they disappeared entirely. The wagon stopped at collection points, picked up more girls, more boys, more people who'd been bought or sold, or simply vanished from places that didn't want them. Nobody asked questions, nobody said names. The girl next to Alara had red hair and burns on her hands. The boy across from them was maybe 12, with a cough that sounded like death. "First time?" the red-haired girl asked. Alara nodded. "You'll want to forget whoever you were before. Makes it easier." "Easier how?" "Easier to survive. That person you were? She's dead. The sooner you accept that, the less it'll hurt." Alara looked at her bound hands, at the rough wool dress they'd given her, at the world disappearing behind them. "Adrian will look for me." But Adrian thought she was dead. There was no rescue coming. Thornfield Estate was a sprawling complex of fields, workshops, and barracks that existed to process labor like grain through a mill. 300 workers at any given time, some indentured, some criminal, some just unlucky, all turning raw materials into profit for an owner nobody ever saw. They sorted the new arrivals like livestock. "You!" a supervisor barked at Alara. "Can you read?" She almost said yes, then remembered the red-haired girl's advice. "No, sir." "So?" "A little." "Kitchen work, then. You'll start in the scullery, break something, and it comes out of your food ration. Slack off, and you'll find yourself in the fields. Understood?" "Yes, sir." She was assigned a bunk in the women's barracks, a room that held 40 people in space meant for 20. Given 2 changes of rough cotton, a blanket that smelled like mildew, and a wooden bowl for meals. "You're lucky," her bunkmate said. A woman in her 30s with scars from old burns running down one arm. Kitchen works better than the fields. You'll eat more. Won't freeze in winter. How long have you been here? Elara asked. 6 years. One more, and I'm free. Then what? The woman laughed without humor. Then I'll be exactly what I am now, except I won't have a roof. Freedom's overrated when you've got no money and no references. Elara lay on the thin mattress that night, staring at the ceiling, and felt something inside her crack clean through. She was 16 years old, declared dead, buried in an empty grave while her stepmother probably celebrated with champagne. And Adrian, brilliant, kind Adrian, who'd looked at her like she mattered, was mourning a girl who'd never even existed to her own family. She pressed her face into the straw-filled pillow and didn't cry. Couldn't cry. Because crying meant admitting this was real. The first month was survival. Wake before dawn. Haul water from the well. Scrub pots that were older than she was, crusted with grease and burned food. Stand over boiling vats of laundry until her hands were raw. Serve meals to workers who looked through her like she was furniture. Eat whatever scraps were left. Sleep. Repeat. The supervisors were efficient rather than cruel. Cruelty implied you noticed people enough to hate them. And at Thornfield, workers were just units of production. You performed or you didn't. You stayed healthy or you got sick. You obeyed or you were punished. Elara learned fast. Keep your head down. Move quickly. Don't draw attention. The girls who complained got sent to the fields. The boys who fought back got locked in the discipline barracks for days without food. Survival meant becoming invisible. By the second month, she'd almost managed it. Then the Thornfield estate changed hands. Sold. The red-haired girl, her name was Anna, whispered during the morning meal. New owner, rich bastard from the capital, apparently, bought this place and 4 others like it. Will it change anything? Elara asked. Anna shrugged. Rich bastards are all the same. They want profit. We're just the machinery that makes it. But something did change. New supervisors arrived, harder, meaner, with rules that made no sense beyond asserting dominance. The food got worse. The work hours got longer. Punishments for minor infractions became public spectacles. The new owner wants efficiency improvements, the head supervisor announced. That means quotas increase by 30%. You'll work harder or you'll work elsewhere. Elsewhere meant the northern mines, where people went and didn't come back. Elara watched a girl collapse in the laundry room from exhaustion and get dragged out by her ankles. Watched a boy lose 2 fingers in the workshop and get told to keep working. Watched Anna get beaten for taking an extra piece of bread. The crack inside her widened. This isn't survival. This is erasure. 3 months in, she was assigned to serve in the main house. The overseer needed girls for a dinner party, some regional administrator visiting to inspect the estate. They wanted workers who could move through rooms without breaking things or looking too pathetic. You, the supervisor said, pointing at Elara. You're clean enough. Try not to embarrass us. The main house was beautiful in the way that rich people's cruelty often is. All dark wood and imported carpets, silver candlesticks, and crystal glasses. Elara served wine to men in expensive coats who discussed production yields like they were talking about weather. Nobody looked at her. She was furniture with hands. Afterward, carrying dishes back to the kitchen, she caught her reflection in a hallway mirror and almost dropped everything. The girl looking back was a stranger, hollow-cheeked, dead-eyed, hair pulled back so severely it pulled at her temples, hands calloused and scarred. Elara Witcom is dead. She believed it now. 4 months, and the first beating. A supervisor's son, 18, cruel in the casual way of boys who'd never been told no, cornered her in the supply room. You're prettier than the others, he said. Under all that grime. Elara tried to slip past. He blocked the door. Don't be like that. I could make things easier for you. Extra food. Lighter duties. No, thank you. His expression curdled. You think you're better than this? Better than me? He grabbed her wrist, the left one, and twisted hard enough to make her gasp. You're nothing, he said conversationally. Livestock with a pulse. You'll do what I want, or I'll make sure you end up in the mines. Something in Elara snapped. She brought her knee up hard, heard him wheeze, and ran. Got 3 steps before he tackled her into a shelf. Glass bottles shattered. Her cheek hit the floor. Then his fists hit everything else. Worthless bitch, think you can... By the time someone pulled him off, Alara couldn't see out of her left eye, and her ribs felt like broken glass. What happened? The head supervisor demanded. She attacked me, the boy gasped. Tried to steal supplies. They didn't even ask her side. She got 10 lashes. Delivered in the courtyard at dawn so everyone could see what happened to thieves. Alara counted each one, 1 through 10, and didn't make a sound. But when they cut her down and she stumbled back to the barracks, Anna caught her before she fell. You should have just let him, Anna whispered. It's easier that way. But Alara couldn't speak because the crack inside her had finally split all the way through, and she was falling into the dark beneath it. 5 months, and she stopped being a person. Just went through the motions. Worked until her body moved on autopilot. Ate because breathing required it. Slept dreamlessly because dreaming hurt too much. The girl who'd loved philosophy was gone. The girl who'd debated politics was gone. Alara Witcom, brilliant, sharp-tongued, impossible to control, was gone. Mary Stone remained. And Mary Stone was very, very good at being invisible. Meanwhile, in a world that no longer included her, Adrian Blackmore stood at a gravestone and felt something fundamental break inside him. Alara Witcom, beloved daughter, gone too soon. He'd returned from military deployment to find her dead. Fever, they said. Sudden. Tragic. She was gone before anyone could send word. Her father had wept through the funeral. Her stepmother had worn black with devastating elegance. The service had been small, tasteful, appropriately mournful, and Adrian had stood there knowing, with absolute certainty, that something was wrong. Because Alara Witcom didn't die quietly. She was too fierce, too alive, too present to just slip away while he was gone. But the doctors confirmed it. The death certificate was signed. The grave was real. Everyone told him grief was making him irrational, so he tried to accept it, tried to move on, failed spectacularly. For 2 years, he visited her grave every month, brought white roses, talked to the stone like she might answer, ignored his father's growing frustration with his unmarried state and his mother's gentle suggestions that he needed to let her go. How do you let go of the only person who ever really saw you? Then the Duke of Ashbourne died unexpectedly, and Adrian became the thing he'd never wanted to be, the Duke himself. With power, with wealth, with responsibilities that didn't care about his grief. He threw himself into work, expanded the duchy's holdings, invested in railways, factories, shipping concerns, acquired properties throughout the northern provinces because managing them was better than thinking about empty graves, including, though he barely noticed at the time, a labor estate called Thornfield. He'd bought it for the land value, for the production reports, for the neat columns of numbers that said it was a solid investment. He never visited. Didn't care to. It was just another property in a portfolio designed to fill the space where a heart used to be. For 3 years, Alara scrubbed his floors while he mourned her memory, close enough to hear his footsteps overhead, too erased to be seen, until one morning when chance and cruelty and a single scar conspired to bring the dead back to life and turn a duke's grief into something far more dangerous, rage. The years blurred together like ink and water. 6 months became a year. A year became 2. Alara stopped counting after that because numbers required hope, and hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. You didn't hope at Thornfield. You survived. You woke up, performed your function, and tried not to think about the fact that this was your life now, had always been your life, would always be your life. The girl who'd read philosophy books felt like a story someone had once told her, something that happened to someone else, in some other world, where girls like her mattered. Here, she was just Mary Stone, scullery maid, kitchen worker, invisible. The beatings had taught her that much. 3 years in, the Thornfield overseer decided the northern properties needed consolidation. Too many estates running independently, too much overhead, not enough control. The solution was simple: shut down the smaller operations and transfer workers to a central location. That location turned out to be the ducal estate at Ashbourne. Pack your things, the supervisor told the kitchen staff. You're being moved south. The Duke's expanding his household operations, needs workers who know their place. Alara had almost nothing to pack. 2 changes of clothes, a wooden bowl, the thin blanket that barely kept her warm. Everything she owned fit in a canvas sack that weighed less than her memories. Ashbourne, Anna muttered as they loaded into wagons. That's the capital district. Rich people everywhere. At least we'll be warm. Alara said nothing. Warmth didn't matter. Location didn't matter. She'd learned that the world was the same everywhere when you were invisible, just different walls around the same cage. The journey took 5 days. They traveled through countryside that went from frozen gray to green, past villages that actually had people in them, children playing, shops with windows full of things to buy. The other workers pressed against the wagon sides, staring at a world they'd almost forgotten existed. Alara kept her eyes down, looking hurt too much. The Ashbourne estate appeared on the 6th morning like something from a dream she'd had once and tried to forget. Massive stone walls, towers that caught the sunrise, gardens that rolled out in geometric perfection, everything trimmed and controlled and beautiful in the way that required armies of invisible hands to maintain. The main house alone was larger than the entire Thornfield complex. Sweet mercy, Anna breathed. How many people live here? Just the Duke and his household staff, someone said, but the estate employs 300 workers. Gardeners, stable hands, kitchen staff, laundry, maintenance. You'll barely see the Duke himself. He keeps to his study mostly. The wagons rolled past the main entrance. Servants didn't use the front, of course, and around to the service buildings. A stern-faced woman in black was waiting, clipboard in hand, looking at them like she was counting inventory. Form a line, she commanded. I'm Mrs. Thornhill, head housekeeper. You'll address me as ma'am, follow instructions exactly, and remember that this household has standards. The Duke of Ashbourne expects perfection. You will provide it, or you will leave. Understood? Yes, ma'am, they chorused. She began assigning positions, stable work, laundry, groundskeeping. The kitchen workers were separated out, evaluated like livestock at auction. When she got to Alara, Mrs. Thornhill paused. You. How long have you been in service? 3 years, ma'am. Kitchen work? Yes, ma'am. Scullery, preparation, serving. Mrs. Thornhill made a note. You'll start in the lower kitchens. Scullery work, pot washing, vegetable preparation. Stay out of sight when the Duke is in residence. Don't speak unless spoken to. Break something valuable, and you'll find yourself back in the north. Clear? Yes, ma'am. Just like that, Alara became part of the machinery that kept the Ashbourne estate running. One more invisible hand in a system designed to be seen only in its results. Perfect meals appearing from nowhere, clean linens, polished silver, floors that gleamed. She was assigned a room in the servants' quarters, shared with 5 other girls, but it had real beds, real blankets, and a window that actually let in light. After 3 years at Thornfield, it felt like luxury. Could be worse, her new roommate said, a girl named Beth, 17, who'd been at Ashbourne for 2 years. The Duke's fare. Doesn't beat servants for fun, pays on time. The work's hard, but the food's decent, and you get a half day off every fortnight. What's he like? Anna asked. The Duke? Beth shrugged. Wouldn't know. Never seen him. He keeps to himself mostly. Lost his wife or his sweetheart or something years ago. They say he's half mad with grief. Visits some grave every month like clockwork, brings flowers, talks to a headstone for hours. Something cold slithered down Alara's spine. What kind of flowers? She heard herself ask. White roses, I think. Why? But Alara couldn't answer because her throat had closed and her hands were shaking, and somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice that sounded like the girl she used to be was screaming. No, it can't be. It's not possible. Except it was, because Adrian Blackmore had been a second son when she'd known him, and his father had been old, sickly, not expected to last long. And if the Duke had died in the past 3 years, that would make Adrian, "You all right?" Beth asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine," Alara managed, "just tired from the journey." But that night, lying in her narrow bed, she couldn't breathe properly, because somewhere in this massive house was the man who'd loved her, who'd mourned her, who thought she was dead and buried and gone while she scrubbed his floors and washed his dishes and existed 3 stories below him like a ghost who'd forgotten how to haunt. She should tell someone. Should find a way to let him know. Should... Should what? Walk up to him covered in scars and kitchen grease and say, "Hello, I'm the girl you think you buried 3 years ago." Surprise. "I've been your property this whole time." He'd think she was insane or a cruel imposter. Or worse, he'd believe her and realize that the girl he'd loved was dead anyway, replaced by this broken thing that knew how to be invisible and not much else. And even if he believed her, even if he somehow recognized her through everything that Thornfield had carved away, what then? Her family had erased her legally, declared her dead, sold her under a false name. Adrian's grief didn't change the fact that Alara Witcom was legally deceased and Mary Stone was legally bound to 7 years' labor. 7 years she hadn't finished serving. No. Better to stay invisible. Better to let the dead stay buried. Better to... A sob caught in her throat, harsh and desperate, and she pressed her face into the pillow before anyone could hear. The girl who'd been Alara Witcom cried silently in the darkness, and the girl who was Mary Stone reminded her that tears changed nothing. Morning came anyway. She went to work. But the lower kitchens existed in permanent controlled chaos. 3 massive hearths burning constantly, copper pots the size of bathtubs, stone sinks deep enough to drown in. The head cook, a formidable woman named Mrs. Carson, ran the operation like a general commanding troops. "You," she said, pointing at Alara. "Pots. Those need scrubbing before the breakfast service or there'll be hell to pay." Alara scrubbed. The work was familiar, mindless. The kind of thing you could do while your brain went somewhere else, which was usually a mercy. Except here, somewhere else meant thinking about the fact that Adrian was upstairs, close enough to hear if she screamed, close enough to save if she asked, close enough to break her completely if she tried and failed. So she kept her head down, scrubbed faster, tried not to think. "Mary," Mrs. Carson's voice cracked across the kitchen. "The Duke's requested breakfast in his study. You'll take it up." Alara's hands froze in the wash water. "Ma'am? The usual girl's sick. You'll have to do. The breakfast tray's there. Don't drop it. Don't speak unless he asks you a direct question. And for heaven's sake, don't stare at anything. The Duke values his privacy." "But I've never..." "Then you'll learn. Move." Her hands were shaking as she lifted the tray. Silver coffee service, covered dishes, fresh rolls, jam in crystal containers, worth more than she'd earn in 5 years. Heavy enough that her arms trembled. She climbed the servants' stairs, narrow, steep, designed to keep them invisible, and emerged on the 3rd floor. The private wing. Thick carpets that muffled footsteps. Portraits of dead nobles watching from the walls. Doors made of wood that probably cost more than a house. The study was at the end of the hall. Alara stood outside it, tray in hand, heart trying to claw its way out of her chest. She could knock. Could deliver the tray like a normal servant. Could leave without saying anything, because what was there to say that wouldn't sound insane? Or she could turn around, tell Mrs. Carson she couldn't do it, accept whatever punishment came. Her hand knocked before her brain could stop it. "Enter," said a voice she'd heard in dreams for 3 years. The study was all dark wood and leather, floor-to-ceiling bookcases, a massive desk covered in papers and ledgers. Morning light came through tall windows, turning dust motes into gold. Adrian sat behind the desk, pen in hand, not looking up. He looked older, harder. The softness she remembered had been carved away by years and grief, leaving something sharper behind. His hair was longer, tied back carelessly. He wore no jacket, just shirt sleeves and a waistcoat, like a man who'd stopped caring about appearances. "On the desk," he said absently. Alara crossed the room on legs that didn't feel attached to her body, set the tray down carefully, started to step back. "Wait," he said, still not looking up. "Tell Mrs. Carson I'll need dinner brought up tonight as well. I'm expecting correspondence from the railway committee and won't have time for the dining room." "Yes, sir." Her voice came out wrong, too rough, too broken. He glanced up. For one terrible second, their eyes met. Alara saw the exact moment he looked past her, through her, the way everyone had for 3 years. Saw herself through his eyes, just another servant, anonymous and irrelevant, one of dozens who kept his house running. He didn't recognize her, didn't see her. "That's all," he said, already looking back at his papers. She left. Made it to the servants' stairs before her knees gave out. "He didn't recognize me," She'd known he wouldn't, had expected it. But some stupid, desperate part of her had hoped, had thought that maybe, somehow, he'd see through the scars and the years and the erasure and know her anyway. That hope died hard. Alara sat on the stairs and felt it bleed out. Days became weeks. She served him breakfast twice more when the regular girl was unavailable. Each time he looked through her like she was furniture. Each time something inside her cracked a little more. The other servants talked about him sometimes, gossiped the way servants always did, trying to make sense of the people who owned their lives. "He's heartbroken," Beth said one evening as they folded linens. "That's why he never remarries, never even looks at women. His whole heart's in that grave." "Waste of a good man," another girl muttered. "Young Duke, all that wealth, and he acts like he's already dead himself." "Romantic, though," Beth sighed. "Loving someone that much." Alara said nothing, because there was nothing romantic about it, nothing beautiful, just waste and grief and two people who'd been destroyed by a lie that neither of them could see past. She worked, stayed invisible, tried to forget that she'd ever been anything else. 4 months at Ashbourne, and the system started to crack. It began with small things, servants getting sick more often, food quality declining, supplies arriving late or not at all. Mrs. Thornhill blamed the new steward, a man named Garrett, who'd been hired to improve efficiency and was instead running the household finances like a personal bank account. "He's stealing," one of the senior footmen said quietly, skimming off the household accounts, ordering cheap supplies and pocketing the difference. "Can't prove it," another replied. "And who'd believe a servant over a steward?" The conditions got worse. Smaller portions at servants' meals, longer hours, deferred maintenance on the servants' quarters until the roof leaked and the heating barely worked. Girls started getting reassigned to special duties for Garrett and his friends, duties that left them hollow-eyed and silent. "Someone needs to tell the Duke," Anna said. "Tell him what?" Beth asked bitterly. "That his steward's a thief? His steward who's saving him money on paper? The Duke doesn't come down here, doesn't see us. We could disappear and he'd never notice." It was true. The Duke of Ashbourne lived in his grief like a castle, walls too high for anything real to penetrate. The servants were just mechanisms. As long as the mechanisms functioned, he didn't look at how. Alara watched it happen with the numb recognition of someone who'd seen this before. At Thornfield, the overseers had been cruel because no one was watching. Here, Garrett was cruel because no one cared. Same cage, different bars. Then it got personal. Anna was one of the girls Garrett targeted. Cornered her in the wine cellar, told her to be accommodating if she wanted to keep her position. When she refused, he had her transferred to the stables, the dirtiest, hardest work on the estate. "It's fine," Anna said, but her hands shook. It's just work." But it wasn't fine, because Garrett was escalating, getting bolder. And nobody with the power to stop him was paying attention. Alara found herself thinking about the girl she used to be. The one who'd challenged tutors, debated nobles, refused to accept injustice just because it was convenient. That girl would have done something, but that girl was dead. Wasn't she? 5 months in, Alara was scrubbing floors in the main hall when she heard voices from the Duke's study. She shouldn't have listened, should have kept working, stayed invisible, remembered that servants who eavesdropped got dismissed. But one of the voices was Garrett's, and something in his tone made her freeze. "Additional efficiencies in the household budget, Your Grace. I've reduced servant expenditures by 20% this quarter." "By reducing quality?" Adrian's voice was tired. "Mrs. Thornhill mentioned issues with supplies." "Minor adjustments. The servants are well cared for, perhaps too well cared for, historically. A bit of discipline improves productivity." "Discipline or cruelty?" "Your Grace is too soft-hearted. These are laborers, not family. They require firm management." A pause, then, "I'll review the accounts myself." "Of course, though I hardly think Your Grace's time is well spent on such trivial matters. You have far more important concerns." Another pause, longer. "Fine, continue as you are, but if there are any serious complaints, there won't be, Your Grace, I assure you." Alara heard footsteps approaching and moved quickly, bucket and brush in hand, head down. Garrett emerged first, saw her kneeling there, and smiled in a way that made her skin crawl. "You," he said. "Mary, isn't it?" "Yes, sir." "You work hard. I've noticed. Good workers deserve recognition." He leaned closer. "Come see me in my office later. I have a special assignment that might interest you." Everything in her went cold. "I'm assigned to the kitchen, sir." "Assignments can change. Let's say 8 o'clock tonight. Don't be late." He walked away whistling. Alara's hands clenched on the scrub brush hard enough to hurt, because she knew exactly what that special assignment was. Had seen enough girls come back from Garrett's office with dead eyes and bruises they tried to hide. She could refuse, could not show up, could end up like Anna, or worse. The girl she used to be would have fought, would have found a way to expose him, to make Adrian see what was happening right under his roof. But the girl she was now knew that fighting got you beaten or broken or erased, and she'd already been erased once. She finished scrubbing the floor with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. He'd up. 7:45 that evening, Alara stood outside Garrett's office, trying to remember how to breathe. She could run, could hide, could throw herself on Mrs. Thornhill's mercy, though the housekeeper answered to Garrett and everyone knew it, or she could go in and let whatever happened happen, because she'd survived worse at Thornfield and survival was all that mattered anymore. The door opened. Garrett stood there, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, smile predatory. "Right on time. I appreciate punctuality. Sir, Come in. Close the door." Every instinct screamed at her to run, but running meant losing this position, and losing this position meant going back to Thornfield or somewhere worse, and she couldn't. She stepped inside. The door closed. Garrett circled her slowly, evaluating. "You're different from the other servants. Quieter. More refined somehow, under all that grime. Where did you work before Ashbourne?" "Thornfield, sir." Hard labor estate. You must have done something to end up there. What was it? Theft? Vagrancy?" "I don't remember, sir." The lie came easily now. "It was a long time ago." "Of course." He moved closer. "Here's the situation, Mary. I run this household efficiently. That efficiency requires cooperation. Girls who cooperate find their work easier. Better food, warmer quarters, perhaps even a bit of money for themselves." His hand touched her shoulder. "Girls who don't cooperate find themselves in very difficult positions. Understanding me?" Alara's voice came from somewhere far away. "Yes, sir." "Good. Now." The door burst open. Adrian stood in the doorway, face like thunder, and for one wild second Alara thought maybe he'd come to save her. Maybe he'd seen through everything. Maybe— "Garrett," he said coldly. "A word. Now." "Your Grace, I'm in the middle of— Now." Garrett's hand dropped from Alara's shoulder. "Of course. Mary, you may go." She fled. Didn't stop until she reached the servants' quarters, locked herself in the washroom, and vomited until nothing was left. Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely turn on the tap. He didn't even see me, didn't even look at me, just wanted Garrett for something else. She'd been seconds away from— "No, don't think about it, don't—" Someone knocked on the door. "Mary, you all right?" Beth's voice. "Fine," Alara managed. "Just sick. Mrs. Carson's looking for you, says you're wanted in the study." Ice flooded her veins. "What?" "The Duke's study. Now. Don't know why, but you'd better hurry." Alara stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror, saw a girl with hollow eyes and shaking hands and bruises forming on her shoulder where Garrett had touched her. "No, I can't face him like this, can't." But servants didn't refuse summons from the Duke. She went. The study looked the same as always, dark wood, leather, books. Adrian stood by the window, back to the door, shoulders rigid. "Close the door," he said quietly. She did. "What's your name?" "Mary Stone, Your Grace." "How long have you been at Ashbourne?" 5 months, Your Grace." "And before that?" "Thornfield Estate, Your Grace." He turned. For the first time in 3 years, he actually looked at her, not through her, at her, and something in his expression made her throat close. "Do you know why I summoned you?" "No, Your Grace." Because I walked past my steward's office 20 minutes ago and heard something that sounded like a threat. Decided to investigate. Found you there looking terrified and Garrett looking like a predator who'd cornered prey." Alara said nothing. "This isn't the first time, is it?" he said flatly. "He's done this before, to other girls." Still nothing. "Answer me." "I can't, Your Grace." "Can't or won't?" "Both." His jaw tightened. "Because if you speak against him, he'll make your life hell. Because even if I believe you, he'll claim you're lying, and servants' words don't carry the same weight as a steward's. Because the system is designed to protect men like him and punish girls like you for daring to resist. Is that about right?" She looked at the floor. "Look at me," he said. She couldn't. "I said look at me." Her eyes lifted, and the dead came back to life. For one impossible second, she saw recognition flash across his face. Saw him actually see her, see past the scars and the grime and the erasure to something underneath. Saw his expression shift from anger to confusion to something that looked almost like... Then it was gone. "I'm dismissing Garrett," he said abruptly. "Effective immediately, he'll be escorted off the property tonight. If he's stolen from the household accounts as I suspect, he'll face criminal charges. I want you to tell Mrs. Thornhill about any other girls he's harmed. They'll receive compensation and he'll answer for every single offense. Your Grace, this is not negotiable. I've allowed things to deteriorate because I was too buried in my own grief to pay attention. That ends now." His voice roughened. "No one in my household should feel afraid. No one should be treated as less than human. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Grace." "Good. You're dismissed." She turned to go. "Mary." She stopped. "If anyone ever threatens you again, staff, steward, anyone, you come directly to me. Will you do that?" The question landed like a stone in her chest. Because the answer was no. Because coming to him meant being seen, and being seen meant risking everything she'd built to survive. But she couldn't say that. "Yes, Your Grace." "Thank you, that's all." She left, made it halfway down the hall before the tears came. Because he'd almost recognized her, almost seen her, and the relief of that, the desperate, dangerous relief, was worse than the years of being invisible. Because invisible meant safe, and being seen meant hope, and hope was the cruelest thing of all. Behind her, alone in his study, Adrian Blackmore stood very still, stared at his hands, and tried to understand why looking at a servant girl he'd never met before had felt exactly like looking at a ghost. The ghost followed him everywhere after that. Not literally. The servant girl Mary went about her duties like always, kept her head down, stayed invisible. But Adrian couldn't stop seeing her, couldn't stop feeling like he'd looked into familiar eyes and found something impossible staring back. He told himself he was being irrational. Grief did that. Made you see the dead in every stranger's face, hear lost voices in the wind, imagine connections that didn't exist. He'd been told that for 3 years by well-meaning friends who thought he needed to move on. But this felt different. He started paying attention to things he'd ignored for years. The servants' quarters with their leaking roofs, the reduced meal portions, the way certain girls flinched when Garrett's name was mentioned. And Garrett was only the most recent symptom of a rot that ran deeper. Adrian had inherited a duchy and let it run itself because managing an estate meant being present. And being present meant not drowning in grief. Easier to lock himself in his study with ledgers and correspondence and pretend the walls between him and the world were protection instead of prison. Now those walls felt like complicity. He dismissed Garrett that night. Had the man's quarters searched, found evidence of embezzlement going back 18 months, turned it over to the magistrate, compensated the household staff from his personal funds, and appointed Mrs. Thornhill as interim steward with instructions to report any further misconduct directly to him. "Your Grace," she'd said carefully, "the staff will appreciate your attention, though I must say this is quite unlike you." "Unlike me how?" "You've been distant since your loss. We understood, of course, but I let things fall apart while I mourned someone who wouldn't have wanted this." He'd looked at her directly. "That changes now. I want weekly reports on household conditions. Any complaints, any issues, anything that affects the staff's well-being. I want to know about it. Mrs. Thornhill had nodded slowly. Of course, Your Grace. Might I ask what prompted this change? He'd thought of hollow eyes in a servant girl's face. Someone reminded me that grief isn't an excuse for blindness. Over the next few weeks, he fixed what he could, repaired the servants' quarters, increased food allowances, established direct channels for complaints. The household slowly began to breathe again, like something that had been suffocating and finally found air. But he couldn't stop thinking about Mary Stone. She appeared sometimes when he called for breakfast, served silently, efficiently, eyes always down. He tried to engage her in conversation once, asked if the household improvements were adequate, if there was anything else needed, and she'd gone so pale he'd thought she might faint. Everything is satisfactory, Your Grace. Thank you. Then she'd fled like he'd threatened her. Adrian stood in his study afterward, staring at nothing, trying to understand why a servant girl's terror felt like a knife in his chest. 6 weeks after Garrett's dismissal, Adrian was reviewing property reports when he found the Thornfield documents. He'd acquired the estate 3 years ago as part of a larger investment portfolio. Never visited, never cared to. It was just a labor operation in the northern provinces, profitable enough, managed by people he'd never met. The reports were standard. Production yields, worker counts, transfers. He almost set it aside. Then he saw a name, Mary Stone, transferred to Ashbourne Estate 5 months prior. His hand froze. Mary Stone, the servant girl with eyes that haunted him. She'd come from Thornfield. She'd said as much when he'd questioned her. But seeing it in writing made something click into place. Thornfield was a hard labor estate. Indentured workers, people who'd been criminals, debtors, or simply unlucky. 7-year contracts, brutal conditions. And Mary had been there for 3 years before the transfer. 3 years. She would have arrived at Thornfield around the same time Alara died. The thought came from nowhere and made no sense. Alara had died of fever in her father's house, surrounded by physicians and family. She was buried in the Witcom family plot. He'd stood at her grave 100 times, but the timing, no. This was madness, grief making connections where none existed. Except. His hands were shaking as he pulled out more files, found the original Thornfield intake records, scanned the names of workers brought in 3 years ago. Mary Stone, age 16, acquired from a private sale, no listed family, bound to 7 years' labor. 16. Alara had been 16 when she died. Adrian's chest constricted. This proved nothing. 16-year-old girls ended up in labor estates all the time. Orphans, criminals, runaways. The name Mary Stone was common enough. The timing was coincidence, but something in his gut was screaming that it wasn't. He needed to see her intake documentation, needed to see if there was anything, any detail, that might explain why looking at a stranger felt like looking at the dead. The Thornfield Records Office was 3 days' ride north. Adrian left at dawn. Meanwhile, Alara was discovering that improved conditions came with a price. Visibility. Before, she'd been one servant among dozens, anonymous and easily overlooked. Now, with Adrian's new attention to household welfare, she was suddenly part of a system that required names, reports, documentation. Mrs. Thornhill had started conducting individual interviews with staff, reviewing employment histories, verifying identities against intake records. It's just administrative, Beth had said. Making sure everyone's contracts are in order, tracking time served for indentured workers. The Duke wants everything proper. But proper meant scrutiny. And scrutiny meant questions Alara couldn't answer. She'd survived 3 years by being invisible, by making sure no one looked at her closely enough to see the cracks in her story. Mary Stone had no past because Mary Stone didn't exist. She was just a name on falsified documents, a ghost wearing someone else's skin. If they looked too closely. Mary Stone? Mrs. Thornhill's voice made Alara jump. She was in the kitchen, elbow deep in dishwater, and the housekeeper was standing there with a ledger and a pen. Yes, ma'am? I need to review your employment record. Just a formality. Can you confirm your intake date at Thornfield? 3 years ago, ma'am. I don't remember the exact date. And before that? I don't remember, ma'am. It was a difficult time. Mrs. Thornhill made a note. Family name? None, ma'am. I was orphaned young. Place of birth? I don't know, ma'am. The housekeeper looked up, frowning. You don't know where you were born? I was very young when my parents died. I don't have clear memories. It was the story she'd told at Thornfield, the story that had worked because no one cared enough to verify it. But here, under Mrs. Thornhill's sharp gaze, it sounded thin. And you can read and write? The question was a trap. If she said yes, it raised questions about an orphan girl having education. If she said no, it was a lie Mrs. Thornhill could easily test. A little, ma'am, the basics. Show me. Mrs. Thornhill handed her the pen, pointed to a blank space in the ledger. Write your name. Alara's hand trembled as she took the pen. She'd avoided writing anything since arriving at Ashbourne, knowing her handwriting, educated, refined, trained by expensive tutors, would give her away faster than anything. She wrote slowly, deliberately malforming the letters. Mary Stone. It looked like a child had written it. Mrs. Thornhill studied it for a long moment. You had some schooling, she said finally. More than most labor workers. Where did you learn? A woman at Thornfield taught me, ma'am. She was kind. Another lie. But Mrs. Thornhill nodded, made a note, and moved on to the next question. The interview lasted 20 minutes. Every answer was a calculated risk, every detail a potential trap. When it was finally over, Alara's hands were shaking so hard she could barely return to the dishes. You all right? Anna asked quietly. You look like you've seen death. Just tired. But that night, lying in her narrow bed, Alara couldn't stop thinking about the questions, about how Adrian's new attention to detail was creating exactly the kind of scrutiny that could destroy her. She should run, should disappear before someone looked too closely and realized Mary Stone was a fiction built on forged documents and desperation. But running meant going back to nothing, to being hunted, to possibly ending up somewhere worse than Thornfield. So she stayed, and prayed no one looked too closely at the girl who didn't exist. Adrian returned from Thornfield 4 days later with a file folder that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The intake documentation for Mary Stone was minimal. A bill of sale from a private transaction. No family listed, no previous address. The girl had been delivered to Thornfield by a private agent, paid in cash. No questions asked. Standard for labor estates. People who ended up there usually had reasons to disappear. But there was one detail that made his blood run cold. A medical examination report required for all new workers. Basic information, height, weight, general health assessment. And at the bottom, in a physician's neat handwriting, notable scarring on left wrist, approximately 2 inches long, appears to be from a blade wound consistent with self-defense. Adrian stared at those words until they blurred. Alara had a scar on her left wrist. He knew because he'd noticed it once during their brief courtship. She'd been reaching for a book and her sleeve had pulled back, revealing a thin white line. When he'd asked about it, she'd laughed. Childhood accident. I was playing with my father's letter opener and learned a valuable lesson about sharp objects. The scar had been distinctive, curved slightly, about 2 inches long on the inside of her left wrist, exactly where the medical report described Mary Stone's scar. His hands were shaking. This was insane. Coincidence. Thousands of people had scars on their wrists. The length and location meant nothing, except it did. Because when you added up the timing, the age, the scar, and the feeling of looking at Mary Stone and seeing a ghost, no, it was impossible. Alara was dead. He'd attended her funeral, stood at her grave, spoken to her father and stepmother about her final days, unless they'd lied. The thought landed like an earthquake, cracking every foundation he'd built his grief on. What if she didn't die? What if they erased her? Adrian stood in his study holding a file folder and feeling reality shift beneath him. He needed proof, needed to see that scar, needed to look Mary Stone in the eyes and ask her questions that only Alara Witcom could answer. And if he was wrong, if grief had finally driven him mad, then he'd know. But if he was right... He called for Mrs. Thornhill. Send for Mary Stone. Now. I need to speak with her immediately. Alara knew something was wrong the moment Mrs. Thornhill found her. The housekeeper's face was pale, her movements urgent. The Duke wants to see you. in his study, right now. Why? Did I do something? I don't know, but he looked strange, upset. Just go. And Mary, she hesitated. Be careful what you say. The walk to the study felt like walking to an execution. Alara's mind raced through possibilities. Had someone discovered her identity? Had her family somehow found out she was alive and come to reclaim their lie? Had Adrian figured out, no, that was impossible, wasn't it? She knocked on the study door. Come in. He was standing by the window, back to the door, exactly like the first time she'd been summoned here. But something was different. The air felt charged, dangerous, like the moment before lightning strikes. She closed the door. You wanted to see me, Your Grace? I did. He didn't turn around. I've been reviewing household records, making sure everything is in order, and I found some irregularities. Her heart stopped. Irregularities, Your Grace. In your intake documentation from Thornfield, there are gaps, missing information, details that don't quite add up. I'm sorry, Your Grace. I don't understand. Where did you get the scar on your left wrist? The world tilted. Your Grace? The scar, the medical report from Thornfield mentions it. A blade wound consistent with self-defense. Where did it come from? She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The room was closing in and she needed to lie, needed to give him some explanation that made sense, but her brain had stopped working. I don't remember. It was a long time ago. Was it a letter opener? The question hit like a physical blow, because that was the lie Alara Witcom had told Adrian Blackmore 3 years ago, in a different life, when she'd been a different person, a lie that Mary Stone couldn't possibly know. What? The word came out broken. He turned around. His face was terrible, grief and hope and rage warring for dominance. Show me your wrist, he said quietly. Your Grace, Show me your wrist. Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely lift her left arm, pushed back the sleeve with nerveless fingers. The scar was there, had always been there. A thin white line on the inside of her wrist, curved slightly, about 2 inches long. Adrian crossed the room in 3 strides, grabbed her wrist, not roughly, but firmly enough that she couldn't pull away, stared at the scar like it held answers to questions he was terrified to ask. A letter opener, he said hoarsely. You told me it was a letter opener. You were 10 years old and curious, and your father had told you not to touch it, but you did anyway. Alara's vision blurred. You said, his voice cracked, you said you learned a valuable lesson about sharp objects, and your father learned a valuable lesson about leaving dangerous things where curious daughters could find them. Stop, she whispered. You were wearing a green dress the day you told me that story. We were in Lord Rothmore's library, and you were explaining why constitutional monarchy was fundamentally unstable, and I was falling in love with you so fast it scared me. Stop. Look at me. She couldn't. Alara, look at me. The name broke something inside her, some final wall she'd built to keep the dead girl buried. Her eyes lifted, and the dead came back to life. For the second time, but now with recognition burning in his gaze like fire. It's you. He breathed. Sweet, merciful. It's actually you. You're alive. You're here. You've been here the whole time, and I couldn't. His hands were shaking as they cupped her face, tilting it toward the light, looking at her like he was trying to memorize every feature, find every piece of the girl he'd lost buried under years of suffering. What did they do to you? His voice broke completely. What did they do? And Alara, who hadn't cried in 3 years, who'd learned that tears changed nothing and made you weak, felt something shatter. I tried, she gasped. I tried to survive, and I tried to be invisible, and I tried so hard not to hope, because hoping hurt too much, and I saw you and I wanted to tell you, but I couldn't. I couldn't. Why? He pulled her closer, hands gentle despite the desperation in his eyes. Why couldn't you tell me? Because Alara Witcom is dead, legally dead. Buried in a grave with a headstone and a death certificate, and I'm just Mary Stone. I'm nobody. I'm property. And if I told you who I was, you'd think I was insane or a liar or the girl I've been mourning for 3 years while she scrubbed my floors and I walked past her like she was invisible. The self-hatred in his voice was terrible. You were in my house, right here, And I didn't see you. You weren't supposed to see me. That was the point. They erased me. My stepmother, my father, they sold me like livestock and told everyone I'd died, and there was no way back, no way to prove who I was, and She couldn't finish. The words were drowning in 3 years of grief and rage and desperate, terrible relief. Adrian pulled her against his chest and held on like she might disappear if he let go. "I've got you," he said roughly. "I've got you, and I'm not letting go. Do you understand? Whatever they did, whatever documents they forged, whatever lies they told, it ends now. You're not Mary Stone. You're not dead. You're Alara, and you're alive, and I am going to burn their world to ashes for this." She should tell him to stop, should warn him that revenge wouldn't change the past, should remind him that she was still legally bound to 7 years' labor, and even a duke couldn't simply erase that. But she couldn't speak, could only cling to him and sob. For the first time in 3 years, Alara Witcom allowed herself to break, and Adrian held every piece. Mom. When she could finally breathe again, he pulled back just enough to look at her. "Tell me everything," he said. "Start to finish. What happened the night you disappeared?" So she told him. About waking to shouting, about the men who dragged her from her room, about Ophelia explaining calmly that Alara was being erased because she was inconvenient, about the docks, the wagon, the journey north to Thornfield, about 3 years of hard labor, beatings, starvation, about being transferred to Ashbourne and finding herself serving the man who thought she was buried. Adrian listened with an expression like stone, but she could see the rage building behind his eyes. When she described Garrett's office, his hands clenched into fists. "He touched you," Adrian said flatly. "Garrett touched you, and I dismissed him for embezzlement when I should have—" "You saved me," Alara interrupted. "You walked in and you stopped it and you gave me a way out. That's what matters. What matters is that you spent 3 years in hell while I mourned a lie." His voice turned savage. "Your father, your stepmother. They declared you dead, forged documents, sold you into labor. That's conspiracy, fraud, unlawful imprisonment. And they're untouchable," Alara said quietly. "My father is a respected merchant with connections throughout the capital. Ophelia's family has noble ties. Who's going to believe a servant girl's word against theirs? Mine. Adrian, I'm the Duke of Ashbourne. My word carries weight, and I have evidence, the intake documents from Thornfield, the bill of sale, the medical reports, enough to start asking questions. Questions they'll deny. They'll say I'm an imposter, that I'm a disturbed girl who latched onto their dead daughter's identity, that you're being manipulated by someone taking advantage of your grief. Then we'll prove otherwise. You know things only Alara would know. Details about your childhood, your education, my childhood that Ophelia orchestrated, my education that she controlled. She knows everything I know, Adrian. She could feed that information to anyone." Alara pulled away, wrapping her arms around herself. "You can't win this by being right. You need them to confess." "And how do I do that?" She looked at him directly. "You make them believe I'm still dead, and then you destroy them piece by piece until they have no choice but to tell the truth." They spent the next 3 hours planning. Adrian would keep her identity secret, even from the household staff. Officially, she was still Mary Stone, though he'd quietly transfer her from kitchen work to his personal staff, with a cover story about needing someone detail-oriented for his correspondence. Meanwhile, he'd begin investigating the Witcom family finances, looking for irregularities, questionable transactions, anything that could be used as leverage. "There has to be something," he said. "People who commit one crime usually commit others. If I can find evidence of fraud, embezzlement, anything actionable, you can force them into a position where confessing about me is the lesser evil," Alara finished. "Make them choose between admitting they faked my death or facing criminal charges for something else." Exactly. It was a long shot, but it was better than nothing. "What do I do?" Alara asked. "You stay safe, stay hidden, and you let me handle this." "Adrian, I'm not helpless. I know you're not. But Alara—" He took her hands carefully, like she was made of glass. "You've been surviving alone for 3 years. You've fought and endured and done things no one should have to do. Let me fight for you now. Please. She wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could handle this herself, but she was so tired of fighting alone. Okay, she whispered, but if this doesn't work, if they come after you or me or anyone, we run. We disappear. I won't let you destroy yourself for revenge. This isn't revenge, it's justice. Sometimes there's no difference. He kissed her forehead gently. Then we'll find out together. The investigation began the next morning. Adrian used every resource at his disposal, hired investigators, reviewed public records, called in favors from magistrates and bankers. Within a week, he'd assembled a picture of the Witcom family finances that raised serious questions. Her father's merchant business was failing, had been failing for years, propped up by increasingly questionable loans. Ophelia's spending was astronomical. She lived like a woman of means while the business hemorrhaged money. And 3 years ago, right around the time Alara died, there'd been a sudden influx of cash, a private sale of unspecified goods for an amount that exactly matched what a young indentured worker might fetch. The pieces were falling into place, but they needed more. They needed proof that couldn't be explained away. There's someone who might help, Alara said carefully. My stepsister Vivian. She tried to warn me the night they took me. She's not cruel like Ophelia, just weak. If you could get her alone, ask her questions. She'd deny everything to protect her mother. Maybe, unless you offer her something she wants more than protection. Adrian looked at her sharply. What does she want? Freedom. From Ophelia, from expectations, from the life she's trapped in. Vivian hated being a pawn. If you could offer her a way out, a marriage to someone kind, a position somewhere far from her mother's influence, she might talk. It was ruthless, but ruthlessness was all they had. Adrian arranged a social event, a charity dinner at Ashbourne, invitation only, featuring prominent families from the region, including the Witcoms. Alara watched from the servants' entrance as they arrived. Her father looked older, grayer, diminished. Ophelia looked magnificent in burgundy silk, diamond necklace catching the light. Celestine and Vivienne followed behind like pale shadows. Seeing them made Alara's chest tight with rage and grief, and something uglier she didn't want to name. You don't have to watch this, Adrian said quietly. He'd found her hiding in the corridor, couldn't resist checking on her even though he should be greeting guests. I need to. I need to see them one more time before they lose everything. His hand found hers in the darkness. They will. I promise you that. The dinner was elegant, refined, perfectly orchestrated. Adrian played the gracious host while his investigators quietly interviewed staff, reviewed the Witcom family documents they'd brought for a supposed business discussion, gathered evidence. And during the dancing, Adrian maneuvered Vivienne into a private conversation. Alara couldn't hear what was said, but she watched through a crack in the door as Vivienne's face went white, then red, then crumpled entirely. Whatever Adrian had offered, whatever he'd threatened, it was working. When the Whitcombs left that night, Vivienne looked back at the house with an expression Alara recognized. Guilt. And that's when she knew they'd won. 3 days later, Adrian received a letter. It was from Vivienne, written in shaking handwriting, and it confessed everything. How Ophelia had convinced their father that Alara was a threat. How they'd arranged for her to be drugged and taken. How the death certificate had been forged, the funeral staged, the grave filled with an empty coffin. How they'd sold her to a labor broker who'd promised she'd disappear into the northern estates and never be heard from again. The letter named names, dates, amounts paid. It was everything they needed. She wants asylum, Adrian said, reading the final paragraph. Says she'll testify in court if I guarantee her protection from her mother. Give her a position in a household far from the capital. Will you? Yes. She's complicit, but she was also 17 and terrified. That doesn't excuse it, but it complicates things. Alara nodded slowly. What happens now? Now I ride to the Witcom estate with magistrates, this letter, and enough evidence to bury them. They'll confess or face criminal prosecution for fraud, kidnapping, and conspiracy. Either way, you get your name back. He said it like it was simple, like justice was guaranteed, but Alara had learned that nothing was guaranteed. Be careful, she said. Ophelia is dangerous when cornered. So am I. He kissed her, gentle and fierce and full of promises. Then he left. And Alara waited in the darkness, heart pounding, knowing that everything was about to change, for better or worse. But Adrian arrived at the Witcom estate with 4 magistrates, 2 investigators, and enough righteous fury to burn the world down. They found Ophelia in the drawing room, serene as ever, entertaining guests. She looked up when Adrian entered, surprise flickering across her face. "Your Grace, what an unexpected pleasure." "Is it?" He tossed Vivian's letter onto the table. "Because I think you've been expecting this conversation for 3 years." Ophelia's eyes dropped to the letter. Something shifted in her expression. "I'm afraid I don't understand." "Then let me clarify. 3 years ago, you conspired to fake the death of your stepdaughter, Alara Witcom. You drugged her, sold her into indentured labor under a false name, and staged a funeral to cover your crime. You did this because she was inconvenient, because a brilliant young woman threatened your plans for your own daughters, because you are a monster who destroys people for convenience." The room had gone silent. Ophelia stood slowly. "That's quite an accusation, Your Grace. Do you have proof?" "I have your daughter's testimony. I have financial records showing the sale. I have intake documents from Thornfield estate, and I have the victim herself alive and ready to testify." For one perfect moment, Ophelia's mask cracked. Alara saw it from the doorway where she'd been hiding, saw the flash of genuine fear. Then it was gone, replaced by ice. "If someone claiming to be my dead stepdaughter has approached you with these lies, Your Grace, I'm afraid you've been deceived. Alara died of fever 3 years ago. We buried her. We mourned her. If some disturbed girl is attempting to take advantage of your grief—" "She has a scar on her left wrist," Adrian said coldly. "From a letter opener. She can describe every room in your house, every detail of her childhood, things only Alara would know. Things I could have told anyone. Could you have told them about the time Alara corrected her Latin tutor and he quit in embarrassment? About how she hated honey because it reminded her of her mother's illness? About the birthmark on her right shoulder shaped like a crescent moon?" Ophelia's face went white, because those were things only family would know. Secret things. True things. "Where's my daughter?" The voice came from the stairs. Alara's father stood there, looking 10 years older than she remembered. "Father," Alara said quietly, stepping into the light. He stared at her like she was a ghost made flesh. No, you died. We buried you. This is some cruel trick." "You buried an empty coffin, and you let your wife sell me to a labor broker for 500 pounds because I was an inconvenience." The room exploded. Ophelia lunged forward, was restrained by magistrates. Alara's father collapsed into a chair, face in his hands. Guests screamed and fled. And through it all, Alara stood perfectly still. "Confess," Adrian said quietly. "Confess what you did or face trial for kidnapping, fraud, and conspiracy. Choose." Ophelia looked at him with pure hatred. Then she smiled. "You think you've won. You think justice means anything. But that girl," she pointed at Alara, "was legally sold. The documents are legitimate. She's bound to 7 years' labor, and not even a duke can break a legal contract without cause." Adrian's expression didn't change. The contract was signed by Mary Stone, a fictitious person. Therefore, it's void. The contract was signed by a legal representative on behalf of an indentured worker. The name doesn't matter. The binding does. She's mine for 4 more years unless you want to buy out her contract, and I assure you, Your Grace, my price will be astronomical. The words landed like stones, because she was right. Even if they proved Alara's identity, even if they won in court, the labor contract was technically legal. Adrian could buy her freedom, but Ophelia would make it cost everything: reputation, wealth, political capital. It was her final play, and it was working. Alara saw Adrian's jaw tighten, saw him calculating options, looking for a way through this that didn't involve giving Ophelia exactly what she wanted. Then Alara stepped forward. "You're right," she said quietly. "The contract is legal, but it was signed under duress by a minor who was kidnapped and sold illegally, which means it's voidable in court, and when we go to trial, and we will, You'll have to explain under oath how a dead girl ended up with a labor contract. You'll have to produce the broker who sold me, the agent who delivered me, everyone who conspired with you. And when they testify to save themselves, your entire house of cards collapses." Ophelia's smile faltered. "So here's my offer," Elara continued. "You confess publicly, in writing. You admit what you did, void the contract, and face whatever consequences the law demands. In exchange, I won't pursue civil damages that would bankrupt you. I won't drag every detail of your cruelty through the papers. I'll let you keep some shred of dignity. And if I refuse, then I'll spend the rest of my life making sure everyone knows exactly what kind of monster wears silk and pretends to be a lady." The room held its breath. Ophelia looked at Elara, really looked at her, and for the first time saw not a frightened girl, but a woman who'd survived 3 years of hell and come back stronger. She'd created this, and now it was going to destroy her. "Fine," Ophelia said. "I'll confess." The confession came 3 days later, written in Ophelia's precise handwriting on legal parchment, witnessed by magistrates and sealed with wax that would make it binding in any court in the kingdom. "I, Ophelia Witcom, do hereby confess that on the night of August 14th, 3 years past, I did conspire with my husband Robert Witcom to fake the death of his daughter, Elara Witcom. We drugged her, removed her from our home, and sold her to a labor broker under the false name Mary Stone. We forged a death certificate, staged a funeral, and buried an empty coffin to conceal our crime. We did this knowingly and willfully, motivated by personal gain and the desire to remove an obstacle to our daughter's marriage prospects. The document went on for 3 pages, detailing names, dates, amounts paid, every ugly truth laid bare in black ink. Elara stood in Adrian's study and read it twice, hands steady, waiting to feel something. Triumph, maybe. Vindication. The satisfaction of watching her tormentors fall. Instead, she felt hollow. "This doesn't bring back 3 years, she said quietly. Adrian looked up from the desk where he was reviewing additional documents. "No, but it gives you legal proof of your identity. The magistrates have already begun processing your restoration paperwork. Within a week, you'll officially be Elara Witcom again. Not a dead girl. Not Mary Stone. Yourself. And them? Your father faces criminal charges for conspiracy and fraud. Ophelia faces the same, plus charges related to the sale of a minor into unlawful labor. The prosecutors are pushing for prison time, 5 years minimum, possibly more. What about Vivian and Celestine? Vivian's testimony bought her immunity. She's being relocated to my aunt's estate in the western provinces, far from Ophelia's influence. She'll have a position there, a chance to build a real life. Celestine? He paused. Celestine claims she knew nothing. Given that she was 14 at the time, the magistrates are inclined to believe her. She's been placed with a guardian until the trial concludes. Elara nodded slowly. It was more than she'd expected, more than she'd hoped for when she'd been scrubbing floors and trying to remember her own name, but it still felt incomplete. "What's wrong?" Adrian asked, reading her expression with the ease of someone who'd spent years grieving her and now couldn't stop looking at her like she might disappear again. "Nothing's wrong. This is justice. This is what we fought for." But she met his eyes. But Ophelia was right about one thing. The contract I signed as Mary Stone, even if it's legally void, even if we prove I was coerced, there are hundreds of other girls in those labor estates who weren't, who are still there, still invisible, still being erased because no one with power cares enough to look. Adrian's expression shifted. "You want to do something about that, don't you? You own Thornfield. You own 4 other estates like it. You have the power to change how they operate. What happens to the people there? We could—" She stopped, shook her head. "I'm sorry. This isn't your fight. You've already done more than anyone had the right to ask." Elara. He stood, crossed to her, took her hands carefully. 3 years ago, I fell in love with a girl who saw systems instead of decoration, who thought everything mattered and connected and had purpose. That girl didn't die at Thornfield. She survived. And now she's standing here telling me we could change something broken. So yes, it's my fight. Tell me what you're thinking." She looked at their joined hands, hers scarred and calloused, his bearing the ink stains of someone who solved problems with paperwork and precision. The labor estates exist because there's profit in human suffering. But what if we made them unprofitable? What if we changed the model entirely, paid actual wages, limited work hours, provided education and training so people could leave with skills instead of just scars? It would cost more initially, but long-term it would create a stable workforce that actually wanted to be there. The other estate owners would never agree to that. It would undercut their operations. So we undercut them first, run our estates at a loss if we have to, just long enough to force them to either match our standards or fail. Use your position to push for labor reform legislation. Make it illegal to operate the way they currently do. Adrian was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled. Actually smiled, the first real one she'd seen since she'd revealed herself. That's brilliant, ruthless and impractical, and exactly the kind of thing that might actually work. He pulled her closer. It'll take years, cost a fortune, make us enemies of every industrialist in the kingdom. I know. And you want to do it anyway. I have to, because I was one of the lucky ones. I had you looking for me, had the evidence to prove who I was. Most people in those estates don't. They're just erased. And if we don't fight for them, no one will. He kissed her forehead gently. Then we fight, together, starting with Thornfield. The announcement came 2 weeks later, published in every major newspaper in the kingdom. The Duke of Ashbourne is pleased to announce the restoration of Miss Elara Witcom to her rightful identity, following her miraculous survival of a kidnapping that resulted in 3 years of unlawful imprisonment. Miss Witcom, previously believed deceased, was discovered alive and in service at the Ashbourne estate. Those responsible for her abduction and the subsequent fraud have confessed and will face criminal prosecution. The Duke wishes to express his profound gratitude for her safe return and his commitment to ensuring such injustices are never repeated. The scandal detonated like a bomb across society. Elara Witcom, dead girl, mourned by a duke, buried and forgotten, was alive. Had been alive the entire time, working as a servant in the very house where the man who loved her lived. The story was too perfect, too dramatic, too impossible to ignore. Within days, every newspaper in the kingdom was running variations on the same headline, "The Girl Who Came Back from the Grave." Artists drew sketches of her based on 3-year-old descriptions. Poets wrote terrible verses about lost love and resurrection. Society matrons who'd never met her claimed to have known all along that something was suspicious about her death. Elara read the papers in Adrian's study and felt like she was watching someone else's life. "They're making me a fairy tale," she said. "Like I'm some kind of romantic tragedy instead of a person." "People love stories with happy endings," Adrian replied, "especially ones involving young love and dramatic revelations." "But it's not the ending. The trial hasn't even started. My father and Ophelia haven't been convicted. I'm still—" She gestured at herself. "Still figuring out how to be a person instead of a ghost." "I know." He looked up from the correspondence he was reviewing. Letters from well-wishers, interview requests, dinner invitations from people who wanted to be associated with the scandal. "But this is good for us strategically. The public attention makes it harder for anyone to dismiss what happened to you as a private family matter, and it gives us leverage for the labor reform campaign." He was right, Elara knew. The publicity was useful, but it also felt like being erased again, just in a different way. Her real story buried under layers of melodrama and speculation. She'd survived 3 years by being invisible. Now she was visible in ways that felt just as dangerous. The first public appearance came 3 weeks after the announcement. A charity gala at the Royal Opera House, attended by every important family in the capital. Adrian had wanted to skip it, but his advisors insisted that hiding would only fuel more speculation. "You need to be seen together," his chief advisor said. "Show that you're united, confident, unbowed by scandal. Let society see that Miss Witcom is a lady, not some pitiful victim." So Elara found herself being fitted for a gown that cost more than a year's wages at Thornfield. Deep blue silk, embroidered with silver thread, cut to show her shoulders and make her look like someone who belonged in ballrooms instead of kitchens. "You look beautiful," Beth said, helping with the final adjustments. The former servant had been promoted to Elara's personal maid, a position that made them both laugh because Beth still sometimes forgot to call her Miss instead of Mary. "I look like I'm wearing a costume," Elara replied, staring at her reflection. The girl in the mirror had curves that 3 years of starvation had carved away. Her hair was professionally styled instead of pulled back brutally. Her skin had been treated with creams that faded scars. She looked like Alara Witcom again, but she didn't feel like her. "Everyone's going to stare," she said quietly. "Of course they are. You're the girl who came back from the dead, but you've survived worse than rich people's judgment." Beth was right. Alara had survived Thornfield, survived Ophelia, survived 3 years of being erased. She could survive a ballroom. The opera house was magnificent, all gold leaf and velvet, chandeliers that dripped crystal, boxes full of nobility pretending to care about music while actually caring about being seen. Alara entered on Adrian's arm and felt 1,000 eyes turn toward her like a physical weight. The whispers started immediately. "That's her." "She doesn't look like she spent 3 years in a labor camp." "Pretty enough, I suppose, though not the beauty the papers claimed. Do you think it's true? Or is she some clever imposter?" Adrian's hand tightened on hers. "Ignore them." "I'm trying." But it was hard, because every face she passed held judgment, some sympathetic, some skeptical, some openly hostile. The women whose daughters had hoped to catch a duke's attention now had to watch him escort a girl who'd been declared legally dead. The men who'd advised him to move on, remarry, produce heirs, now had to accept that he'd chosen a servant over their carefully curated candidates. She was an inconvenience. Again. They found their box, prime location, center of the house, and settled in just as the performance began. Alara tried to focus on the music, but she could feel the stares, hear the whispers even over the orchestra. During intermission, it got worse. A steady stream of people came to pay their respects. Most were merely curious, wanting to see the scandal up close. Some were genuinely kind, expressing relief at her survival. Others were barely concealed vultures, asking invasive questions disguised as concern. "How dreadful your experience must have been, my dear. Tell me, were you terribly mistreated? I imagine you must be grateful to His grace for rescuing you from such squalor. And your family, such a tragedy that they were deceived about your death. You must be devastated by their betrayal." Alara answered with the polite phrases Adrian's advisors had coached her on. Yes, it was difficult. Yes, she was grateful. Yes, she looked forward to justice being served. But inside she was screaming. Then Lady Pemberton arrived, a formidable woman in her 60s who'd known Alara's mother. "Alara Witcom," she said, looking her up and down with sharp eyes. "I knew your mother. Fine woman, too good for the man she married. You have her eyes." "Thank you, my lady." "Don't thank me. I'm not here to flatter you. I'm here to tell you that half these people think you're a fraud and the other half think you're damaged goods. They're watching to see which you prove to be." Adrian stiffened. "Lady Pemberton." "Oh, hush, boy. She needs to hear this." The old woman focused on Alara. "You've been through hell. Everyone knows it. Question is whether you'll let that define you or whether you'll show them that you're more than your suffering. Your mother would have chosen the latter. What will you choose?" Alara met her gaze steadily. "I choose to remember that the people judging me have never had to scrub floors until their hands bled, that they've never been beaten for taking an extra piece of bread, that their worst day would break them faster than my best day broke me. So their opinions mean exactly nothing." Lady Pemberton smiled, a fierce, approving thing. "Good. You'll need that spine. The trial starts next week. Your stepmother's lawyers will try to destroy you in court. They'll make you relive every moment, question every detail, try to prove you're lying or insane or both. Can you handle that?" "I survived Thornfield. I can survive lawyers." "Then you might just be worthy of the boy who's been mourning you for 3 years. She patted Adrian's shoulder. "Don't let her forget who she is, Your Grace. The world will try. Your job is to remind her." She swept away, leaving silence in her wake. Adrian looked at Alara. "Are you all right?" "No, but I will be." The second half of the performance was easier. Word had spread about Lady Pemberton's public endorsement, and people who'd been whispering now nodded respectfully when they caught her eye. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was acknowledgement. She existed. She mattered. That was something. Cheers. The trial began on a cold morning in late autumn in the central courthouse where the kingdom's most serious cases were adjudicated. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with reporters, curiosity seekers, people who wanted to witness history or scandal or both. Elara sat in the front row beside Adrian's lawyer, a sharp-minded woman named Catherine Hartwell, who'd built her reputation defending impossible cases. "Remember," Catherine said quietly, "answer only what's asked. Don't elaborate. Don't let them provoke you into anger. You're not on trial here. They are." Elara nodded. Across the aisle, Ophelia sat between her lawyers, dressed in black like she was already mourning her freedom. Her father sat beside her, looking smaller somehow, diminished by shame. Neither of them looked at Elara. The judge entered, a stern man in his 60s named Justice Blackwell, known for being harsh but fair. "This court is now in session," he announced. "The Crown versus Robert and Ophelia Witcom, charges of conspiracy, fraud, kidnapping, and the unlawful sale of a minor into indentured servitude. How do the defendants plead?" Ophelia's lawyer stood. "The defendants plead guilty to fraud and conspiracy, Your Honor, but maintain that the indentured labor contract was entered into legally and—" "Save it for testimony," Justice Blackwell interrupted. "Prosecution, call your first witness." The prosecutor, a stern woman named Margaret Cross, stood smoothly. "The Crown calls Elara Witcom." Every eye in the courtroom turned toward her. Elara stood on legs that didn't shake and walked to the witness stand, placed her hand on the book, and swore to tell the truth. Then she sat and looked directly at Ophelia and began to speak. She told them everything, about the night she was taken, about the journey north, about Thornfield, the beatings, the starvation, the systematic erasure of everything she'd been, about being transferred to Ashbourne and serving the man who thought she was dead. She described the scar on her wrist that matched medical records, the details of her childhood that only Elara Witcom would know, the confession letter that Ophelia herself had written. The courtroom was silent except for her voice. When she finished, Prosecutor Cross nodded. "Thank you, Miss Witcom. Your witness." Ophelia's lawyer stood, a slick man named Rawlings, who looked like he'd been fed on expensive wine and moral compromise. "Miss Witcom, or should I call you Mary Stone? That was the name you used for 3 years, was it not?" "That was the name I was forced to use after my identity was stolen." "Stolen? Strong word, but let's examine that. You claim you were kidnapped from your family home, yet no one reported you missing. No neighbors saw anything suspicious. No servants came forward. Convenient, wouldn't you say?" "Convenient for the people who erased me, yes. Or perhaps," he smiled, "perhaps you ran away. A rebellious 16-year-old who'd been rejected by a suitor, who fought with her stepmother, who wanted adventure, and found it went poorly. And now, 3 years later, you've concocted this elaborate story to avoid the consequences of your own choices." Catherine was on her feet. "Objection. Counsel is testifying." "Sustained. Mr. Rawlings, ask questions." "Of course, Your Honor." He turned back to Elara. "Miss Witcom, can you prove you didn't run away voluntarily?" "Can you prove I did?" "I'm asking the questions here." "Then ask better ones." Laughter rippled through the courtroom. Justice Blackwell's mouth twitched. Rawlings's smile thinned. "You claim to have been beaten at Thornfield, yet you bear remarkably few scars for someone who endured 3 years of abuse. The scars that show aren't the only ones that matter. How convenient that the ones that would prove your story are invisible." The medical records from Thornfield document injuries consistent with abuse. The testimony from other workers confirms the conditions. "My scars are real. You just don't want to see them." He changed tactics. "Let's talk about the Duke of Ashbourne. You're currently residing in his household, correct?" "Yes." "In what capacity?" "As his guest." "His guest. How intimate. Tell me, Miss Witcom, did you plan this from the beginning? Learn about the Duke's grief over his lost love, position yourself in his household, slowly reveal yourself to take advantage of his emotional vulnerability?" Catherine shot to her feet. "Objection! This is outrageous!" But Elara cut her off. "I planned nothing except survival. I served breakfast to a man who looked through me like I was furniture. I scrubbed his floors while he walked past. I watched him mourn at a grave and knew that telling him the truth would either destroy him or destroy me. I hid because hiding was all I had. And if you think manipulating someone requires that kind of dedication to suffering, then you've never actually been desperate. The courtroom erupted. Justice Blackwell's gavel came down like thunder. Order! Order in this court! Rawlings looked rattled. No further questions. Alara stepped down, hands steady, and returned to her seat. Catherine leaned over. That was perfect. That was the truth. Even better. The trial lasted 4 days. They called witnesses. The labor broker who'd sold Alara, now facing his own charges and eager to cooperate. The physician who'd examined her at Thornfield and documented her injuries. Anna, who testified about conditions at the estate. Vivienne, who described the night Alara disappeared and confirmed Ophelia's confession letter. Each piece of testimony built on the last, creating a picture so damning that even Ophelia's expensive lawyers couldn't dismantle it. On the 4th day, Justice Blackwell delivered his verdict. I find the defendants guilty on all charges. Robert Witcom, you allowed your wife to destroy your daughter's life out of weakness and greed. Ophelia Witcom, you orchestrated a conspiracy that robbed a young woman of 3 years of her life and nearly succeeded in erasing her completely. The law provides specific penalties for such crimes, and I intend to apply them fully. He sentenced Robert to 7 years in prison. Ophelia to 10. Additional fines would bankrupt them completely. Every asset seized, every property sold, the family name effectively destroyed. When the gavel came down, Alara felt nothing, then everything. Relief and grief and rage all crashing together until she couldn't separate them anymore. Adrian's hand found hers. It's over. No, she said quietly. It's just beginning. The aftermath of the trial was chaos. The Witcom estate was liquidated to pay fines and victim compensation. Alara received a portion, blood money she immediately donated to establishing a fund for former labor workers. Vivienne's testimony had bought her immunity but cost her any relationship with her mother. Celestine disappeared into guardianship, her future uncertain. The scandal dominated newspapers for weeks. Some praised Alara's courage. Others questioned whether her story was too convenient, too dramatic. Debates raged in Parliament about labor reform, with conservatives insisting the current system was fine and progressives demanding immediate change. Adrian threw himself into the reform campaign with single-minded determination. He converted Thornfield into a model estate, paid wages, limited hours, education programs. Other estate owners screamed about unfair competition. He smiled and told them to match his standards or fail. And Alara had to learn how to be a person again. Not a servant, not a victim, not a symbol or a scandal, just herself. It was harder than surviving Thornfield had been. She had nightmares about the barracks, about Garrett's office, about empty graves. She flinched at raised voices. She hoarded food in her room without meaning to, old survival instincts refusing to die. But she also read philosophy again, debated politics with Adrian until midnight, wrote articles about labor reform that newspapers actually published, started designing an education program for estate workers that would give them real skills and real choices. Slowly, painfully, the girl who'd been erased began to remember how to exist. 2 months after the trial, Adrian found her in the library at midnight, surrounded by books and papers, working on legislation proposals. "You should sleep," he said. "Can't. This section on contract enforcement needs to be ironclad, or they'll find loopholes." He sat beside her, took the pen from her hand gently. "Alara, it's midnight. The legislation will still be there tomorrow. But people are suffering now. Every day we delay is another day someone spends in conditions like Thornfield. And you'll help them better if you're not exhausted." He turned her to face him. "You've been running on rage and determination for months. At some point, you need to let yourself rest." "I don't know how to rest. For 3 years, rest meant death. Stopping meant starving. I can't just—" Her voice cracked. "I can't just turn that off." "I know, but you're safe now. You're free. You won your name back, destroyed the people who tried to erase you, and you're changing a system that hurt you and thousands like you. You won, Ilara. At some point, you have to let yourself feel that. She looked at him, at this man who'd mourned her for 3 years, who'd fought for her, who'd stood beside her through scandal and trial and transformation. I don't feel like I won. I feel like I lost 3 years and got back a stranger wearing my face. Then we'll figure out who that stranger is. Together. No rush. No pressure. Just time. He kissed her forehead, gentle and patient, and for the first time since the trial ended, Ilara let herself cry. Not from grief or rage, from relief, because she'd survived. And survival, she was learning, was only the beginning. The first public recognition came from an unexpected source. Lady Pemberton hosted a dinner party 3 months after the trial, a small, exclusive affair attended by the kingdom's most influential women. Politicians' wives, business owners, society matrons who actually controlled the purse strings behind their husbands' power. And Ilara. "You're wondering why you're here," Lady Pemberton said as they gathered in her drawing room. "I'll tell you, because you're the first woman in a generation to stand in front of this kingdom's justice system and make it bend. Not through marriage, not through beauty, but through sheer refusal to be erased. That matters." "It was just the truth," Ilara said quietly. "The truth backed by evidence, strategy, and the willingness to stand in a courtroom and stare down people who wanted you to disappear." Lady Pemberton smiled. "You've made enemies, powerful ones. Every estate owner in the kingdom knows your name and hates what you represent. But you've also made allies. Women who are tired of watching girls disappear into service with no recourse. Men who actually believe justice should apply to everyone. You've started something, whether you meant to or not." "What do you mean?" "I mean there are 17 labor reform bills being introduced in Parliament next session. 7 estate owners have voluntarily improved conditions to match Ashbourne standards. The Crown is investigating 3 labor brokers for illegal trafficking. You didn't just win your case, you changed the conversation." Ilara stared at her. "I didn't do that alone. Adrian is a duke with resources, but resources without direction accomplish nothing. You gave him direction. You showed him what needed fixing, and together you're building something that might actually last." Lady Pemberton raised her glass. "To the girl who came back from the grave and decided the dead shouldn't be the only ones who get justice." The room echoed the toast, and Ilara, standing among women who controlled empires from drawing rooms, felt something shift. She'd been erased once, but she'd come back, and the world would never forget it. 6 months after Lady Pemberton's dinner, Ilara stood before the Parliamentary Labour Committee and felt the weight of 300 pairs of eyes trying to determine if she was brave or broken. The committee chamber was designed to intimidate. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, rows of seats arranged in a semicircle so witnesses stood alone in the center, surrounded. Every member of Parliament who cared about labor issues was there, plus a dozen who just wanted to see the scandal up close. "Miss Witcom," the committee chair said, Lord Ashford, a man in his 60s with the kind of face that suggested he'd never worried about where his next meal was coming from. "You've submitted a comprehensive proposal for labor reform. Before we discuss specifics, I'd like to understand your qualifications. What makes you an expert on estate management?" It was a trap. She knew it. They all knew it. If she claimed expertise, they'd dismiss her as arrogant. If she admitted she wasn't an expert, they'd dismiss her as unqualified. Ilara looked at him directly. "I'm not an expert on estate management, Lord Ashford. I'm an expert on being managed. I spent 3 years in labor estates where profit mattered more than people. I know what it's like to work 16-hour days on a single meal, to be beaten for speaking, to watch girls my age die from exhaustion and have their deaths recorded as natural causes because dead workers don't sue. I can't tell you how to maximize efficiency, but I can tell you exactly how your current system destroys human beings. And if you think that's not expertise worth hearing, then you've already decided people like me don't matter." Silence fell like a hammer. Lord Ashford's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Point taken. Proceed with your proposal." Ilara took a breath and began. She outlined everything she and Adrian had spent months developing. Mandatory wage minimums, maximum work hours, required rest days, independent inspections, education programs, legal protections for workers who reported abuse, criminal penalties for estate owners who violated standards. The conservatives on the committee attacked immediately. This would bankrupt half the estates in the kingdom, one lord protested. Only the ones running on slave labor, Alara replied. The rest would adapt. You're proposing to destroy an economic system that's functioned for centuries. I'm proposing to fix a system that functions by destroying people. If the only way your business survives is by treating workers as disposable, then your business deserves to fail. Easy to say when you're protected by a duke's wealth. I said it when I had nothing. I'm saying it now. The difference is, now you have to listen. The debate raged for 3 hours. Numbers were thrown at her. Profit margins, employment statistics, economic projections. She countered with mortality rates, injury reports, testimony from workers who'd survived estates like Thornfield. When it was finally over, Lord Ashford called for a recess. The committee will review your proposal and issue recommendations within the month. It wasn't a victory, but it wasn't a dismissal either. Alara left the chamber shaking, adrenaline crashing now that she didn't need it anymore. Adrian was waiting in the corridor. You were magnificent. I was terrified. You didn't show it. I've learned how to hide things. He pulled her close, right there in the middle of Parliament, not caring who saw. You don't have to hide anymore. Not from me. Not from them. You won the right to be seen, Alara. Use it. She buried her face in his shoulder and tried to believe him. The committee issued their recommendations 3 weeks later. They'd adopted 70% of Alara's proposals. The rest were under consideration pending economic impact studies, which meant they'd been watered down or delayed but not completely rejected. It wasn't everything, but it was something. The Labor Reform Act passed Parliament 2 months later, supported by an unlikely coalition of progressives who wanted change and conservatives who'd realized the public was watching. The king signed it into law on a cold spring morning, and just like that, conditions for estate workers across the kingdom became legally protected. Not perfect, not enough, but better. And the law was named in honor of the girl who'd survived to demand it, the Witcom Labor Protection Act. When Alara heard the name, she laughed until she cried. They named a law after me, a law that exists because I refuse to stay buried. You changed the kingdom, Adrian said quietly. That's not a small thing. It's not enough. There are still workers suffering, still estates operating at the minimum standards, still, and you'll keep fighting for them. But Alara, he turned her to face him. At some point, you need to let yourself accept that you've already done something extraordinary. You survived. You fought back. You won. Not just for yourself, but for thousands of people who couldn't fight for themselves. That matters. She knew he was right, but accepting victory felt dangerous somehow, like the moment she stopped fighting would be the moment everything fell apart. I don't know how to stop, she admitted. Then don't stop. Just pause. Long enough to realize that the girl who was erased has become someone no one can ignore. He was looking at her with an expression that made her chest tight. What? She asked. Marry me. The words landed like stones in still water, ripples spreading outward until they touched everything. Adrian, I know it's fast. I know we're still figuring out who we are after everything, but I've spent 3 years mourning you and 6 months watching you rebuild yourself into something even more extraordinary than before. I don't want to waste any more time pretending I don't know exactly what I want. What if I'm not ready? Then I'll wait. A month, a year, 10 years, however long it takes. But I'm asking now because I need you to know that this isn't pity or obligation or me trying to fix what was broken. This is me choosing you, the real you, scars and nightmares and righteous fury and all. Alara stared at him, this man who'd fought for her when she was invisible, who'd stood beside her through scandal and trial, who'd believed her when the world said she was dead. I'm still figuring out who I am, she said carefully. The girl you fell in love with 3 years ago isn't the same person I am now. I know, and I'm falling in love with this version too. The one who stands in front of Parliament and refuses to back down. The one who turns trauma into legislation. The one who survived hell and came back fighting. What if I'm too broken? Then we're broken together. I've been half dead for 3 years, Alara. You brought me back to life. Let me spend the rest of mine making sure you never doubt that you're seen, valued, and loved exactly as you are." She wanted to say yes, wanted it so badly her chest ached, but there was one thing she needed to do first. "Ask me again," she said quietly. "After I've gone back." "Back where?" "Thornfield. I need to see it one more time. Need to stand in that place as Alara Witcom instead of Mary Stone and know that I survived it." Understanding crossed his face. "Then we'll go together." "No, I need to do this alone." It took him a moment, but he nodded. "How long?" "A week, maybe 2, however long it takes to bury the ghost." "And then?" "Then ask me again." He kissed her, gentle and fierce and full of promises. "I'll be waiting." Alara arrived at Thornfield on a gray morning that smelled like rain and old memories. The estate looked smaller than she remembered, less menacing, just buildings and fields, the machinery of profit stripped of the power she'd given it. The new overseer, a woman named Margaret, whom Adrian had personally appointed, met her at the gate. "Miss Witcom, His Grace sent word you'd be coming. How can I help?" "I just need to walk, see the place, talk to some of the workers if they're willing." Margaret nodded. "The conditions have improved significantly since the Duke implemented reforms. Paid wages, 8-hour workdays, education programs. We've had 3 workers complete training and move on to better positions. She paused. "It's what it should have been all along." "But wasn't." "No, I've read the old records. What happened here before was unconscionable. I'm sorry you experienced that." "Don't apologize. Just make sure it never happens again." Alara walked through the estate alone, past the kitchens where she'd scrubbed pots until her hands bled, past the barracks where she'd learned to sleep through Anna's nightmares and her own, past the courtyard where she'd been beaten for refusing to submit. Workers stared at her as she passed. Some recognized her from newspapers. Others just saw a well-dressed lady walking where ladies didn't belong. She found Anna in the new workshop, a bright, clean space where workers learned carpentry, metalwork, practical skills they could use elsewhere. "Mary?" Anna gasped, then caught herself. "I mean, Miss Witcom. I didn't know you were coming." "I needed to see the place, see you, make sure you're all right." Anna laughed shakily. "I'm more than all right. I'm learning metalwork. In 3 months, I'll have enough saved to leave here and start my own shop. The Duke's program provides startup loans for trained workers. Can you believe it? Me, owning a business." "I can absolutely believe it. You're brilliant with your hands. Always were." They talked for an hour, about the changes at Thornfield, about workers who'd left for better positions, about the ones still serving their contracts but with hope now instead of despair. "You did this," Anna said finally. "You got out and you didn't just forget about us. You fought until things changed. That's everything." "I had help, and I had motivation. I knew what this place could do to people. Couldn't just walk away and pretend it was someone else's problem. Most people would have. Most people don't spend 3 years having their humanity stripped away. That either breaks you or it teaches you exactly what matters." Alara looked at her seriously. "When you leave here, when you start your business, hire people others won't. The ones with gaps in their work history, the ones who ended up in places like this through bad luck. Give them the chance I got." "I will. I promise." They parted with an embrace that felt like closing a chapter. Alara spent 2 more days at Thornfield, talked to workers, reviewed Margaret's program, sat in the barracks where she'd once slept, and felt nothing but relief that it was behind her. On the 3rd day, she stood in the courtyard where she'd been beaten and felt something inside her finally release. She'd survived this place. She'd changed this place. And now she could leave it behind. Not forgotten, never forgotten, but transformed from a prison into proof that broken systems could be rebuilt. The girl who'd arrived here broken had left unbreakable. And that was enough. She returned to Ashbourne on a sunny afternoon, travel-worn and exhausted and lighter somehow. Adrian met her at the door. "Did you find what you needed?" "I found proof that I survived, that the girl they tried to erase became someone who changed the world. That's—" her voice caught. "That's more than enough." "Good, because I've been going insane waiting to ask you again." "Ask me what?" He dropped to one knee right there in the entrance hall, where servants were pretending not to stare. Alara Witcom, the girl who came back from the grave, the woman who refused to stay buried, the voice that changed a kingdom. Will you marry me? She pulled him to his feet, laughing through tears. Yes, 1,000 times yes. He kissed her like she was air and he'd been drowning, and somewhere in the back of Alara's mind, the girl who'd been 16 and erased and declared dead smiled, because she'd survived, and survival was just the beginning. The wedding took place 6 months later in the gardens at Ashbourne, not the formal affair that dukes were supposed to have. No political alliances or society pageantry, just people who mattered, who'd fought beside them or believed in them or simply wanted to witness something beautiful after so much ugliness. Lady Pemberton attended, along with the women from her dinner party who'd become Alara's unlikely allies. Margaret came from Thornfield with Anna and 3 other former workers. Catherine Hartwell, the lawyer who'd defended her case. Mrs. Thornhill, who'd learned to see past uniforms to people. Beth, who stood beside her as she prepared, adjusting her dress and crying. You look perfect, Beth said, like you were always meant to be here. I was always meant to be here. I just had to fight my way back. Adrian waited at the altar in his formal coat, looking at her like she'd hung the stars. When she walked down the aisle, she wasn't thinking about the empty grave with her name on it, wasn't thinking about the 3 years of erasure or the trial or the scandal. She was thinking about the fact that she'd survived, that she'd refused to disappear, that the girl they'd tried to bury had become someone no one could ignore. The ceremony was simple, promises made and meant, rings exchanged, hers engraved with words only they understood. The dead don't come back. Until they do. When the officiant pronounced them married, Adrian pulled her close and whispered, I've got you. Always. I know, she whispered back, but I've got me too now. That's what matters. He smiled against her hair. That's everything. The reception was held in the same ballroom where she'd first felt society's judgment. But tonight, no one was whispering about scandal or damage. Tonight, they were celebrating. Lord Ashford approached with his wife, looking uncomfortable. Miss Witcom, Your Grace, I wanted to apologize for my skepticism during the committee hearing. You were right about the reforms. Initial reports show productivity hasn't decreased despite the improved conditions. In some estates, it's actually increased. People work better when they're treated like people, Alara said evenly. Shocking concept. His wife smiled. What my husband is trying to say is that you've proven your point. The kingdom is better for your stubbornness. The kingdom is better because enough people decided suffering wasn't acceptable. I just made it harder to ignore. They moved on, and Adrian pulled her onto the dance floor. Having fun? He asked. Watching people who thought I'd disappear now having to treat me as an equal? Absolutely. He laughed, spinning her. What happens next? Next? You've won your name back, won justice, changed the law. What do you fight for now? She thought about it. About all the workers still suffering in estates that met minimum standards but nothing more. About the girls being sold into service through legal channels that were barely better than what had happened to her. About systems that were improved but not fixed. Everything, she said finally. I fight for everything until there's nothing left to fix. That's going to take a while. Then it's fortunate I have time. She looked up at him. And help. Always. They danced until the stars came out, until the guests began to leave, offering congratulations and promises of support for future reform efforts, until it was just them and the servants clearing dishes and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new fights. But tonight was theirs. Later in their private chambers, Adrian watched her let down her hair, remove the jewels, shed the Duchess costume to become just Alara. Any regrets? He asked. About marrying you? Never. About the fight that brought us here? She paused. I regret that it was necessary, that people had to suffer for anything to change, but I don't regret surviving. Don't regret becoming someone who fights back. Good, because the woman I married is fierce and brilliant and absolutely terrifying to people who profit from cruelty. Don't ever lose that. She crossed to him, took his hands. I won't, because I remember what it's like to be powerless, to be invisible, to be erased. And as long as I have breath and voice, I'll make sure no one else has to feel that way. Even if it makes you enemies? Especially if it makes me enemies. Enemies mean you're doing something that matters. He pulled her close, rested his forehead against hers. I love you. The girl you were, the woman you've become, whoever you'll be tomorrow, all of it. I love you too. Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible, for believing me when I was a ghost, for standing beside me when the world said I should stay buried. Always, he promised, though technically you saved yourself. I just provided resources. You provided hope. That's more valuable than resources. They stood together in the quiet, two people who'd lost each other and found their way back through courage and stubbornness and love that refused to accept death as an ending. Outside, the estate slept. 300 workers in quarters that were warm and safe, earning wages that could build futures, learning skills that could change lives. A system that wasn't perfect, but was better, because one girl had refused to stay erased. And in a grave across the kingdom, a headstone still read, Elara Witcom, beloved daughter, gone too soon. But the girl it supposedly marked was very much alive, creating legislation in Parliament, running education programs, writing articles that newspapers fought to publish, standing beside a duke who'd loved her as a girl and married her as a woman who'd become so much more than either of them had imagined. The dead don't come back until they do. And when they do, when they rise from graves that couldn't hold them, when they speak with voices that can't be silenced, when they transform suffering into systems that protect instead of destroy, they change everything. 5 years later, Elara stood in front of the Royal Commission on Labor Rights and presented her report on estate conditions across the kingdom. The reforms had worked. Mortality rates down 60%, worker retention up, education programs producing skilled laborers who went on to start businesses, raise families, contribute to communities instead of just surviving them. But there was still work to do. We've fixed the most egregious abuses, she told the commission. But minimum standards aren't the goal. They're the floor. We need to keep pushing. Better wages, more protections, pathways out of labor contracts that don't require years of servitude. The question isn't whether we can afford to do better. It's whether we can afford not to. The commission voted unanimously to expand the reforms. When Elara left the chamber, reporters surrounded her, questions about her work, her marriage, her plans. She answered them with the confidence of someone who'd learned that being seen wasn't dangerous. It was power. That night, she returned to Ashbourne to find Adrian in his study, reviewing proposals for a new educational institution specifically for former labor workers. How did it go? He asked. They approved everything. Full expansion of protections, increased funding for education programs, criminal penalties for violations. You're going to run out of things to fix eventually. Doubtful. But if I do, I'll find new problems. She sat beside him, looked at the proposals. What's this? The Witcom Academy, a school for workers who want more than basic training. Literature, philosophy, law, medicine, real education. So the next girl who ends up in a labor estate doesn't have to pretend she can't read to survive. Her throat tightened. You're naming it after me. After the girl who proved that intelligence and determination matter more than birthright. Who better? She kissed him, fierce and grateful. I love you. I know. You tell me every day by refusing to stop fighting. They worked late into the night, as they often did. Building systems, writing policies, creating futures for people who'd been told they didn't deserve them. And somewhere in the darkness, in the space between what was and what could be, the girl who'd been erased smiled. Because she'd survived. Because she'd fought back. Because she'd become the voice that couldn't be silenced, the presence that couldn't be ignored, the force that changed a kingdom, from invisible servant to duchess, from erased to undeniable, from survival to power. And in a house once built on silence, her voice had become the one that mattered most. Not because a duke had chosen her, but because she'd chosen herself. First. Always. And that made all the difference.